Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution and our first video on Area of Study 2. In this video, we will start looking at the Bolsheviks' consolidation of power following the October Revolution. So this is one of two videos on the first 5 months of the new government and their consolidation of power. And in this video, we'll be looking at the new regime from October 1917 to April 1918. Here's a quote from historian William Chamberlain. He said, "The holding of power by the Bolsheviks was a far greater achievement than the taking of it." So just by that quote, you can tell that they are going to face some challenges along the way. Some will be mentioned in this video. Some more serious challenges will be mentioned in future videos. So where we left off, the October Revolution led to the formation of a Soviet government on the 27th of October 1917. This government was called the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom. And while the Bolsheviks had mass support for their ideal of all power to the Soviets, workers and soldiers had not favored all power to the Bolsheviks. And with the makeup of the new government, that was a significant fear for many. Well, not fear, it was a worry for many workers and soldiers. And so to appease people's concerns, Lenin claimed that the Sovnarkom would only rule until the Constituent Assembly convened in January 1918. We'll talk about the Constituent Assembly in our next video. And he also said that the proposed November elections would go ahead as planned. They were meant to go ahead with the provisional government. And now, after the October Revolution, Lenin has promised that they would continue to go ahead. So key knowledge. So here is the key knowledge, all of the key knowledge for Area of Study 2, and the yellow bolded key knowledge points are what we will talk about in this video. So we'll talk about the challenges the new regime faced in attempting to consolidate its power, including the initial problems faced by the Sovnarkom and the policies of state capitalism. We'll talk about the changes and continuities in political, social, cultural, and economic conditions that influence leaders to compromise and or achieve their revolutionary ideals, including the role of the Cheka, the issuing of new decrees, and state capitalism. We'll talk about the role of one significant individual that influenced and changed society, and his name is Felix Dzerzhinsky, otherwise known as Iron Felix. And we'll touch on the diverse revolutionary experiences of social groups. Mainly in this video, we'll be looking at the experiences of nobles and the bourgeoisie. So let's start by talking about the initial challenges faced by the Sovnarkom, or to use the language of the study design, the initial problems faced by the Sovnarkom. So I've broken these up into three key categories: social, political, and economic. In terms of social challenges, there was a mass breakdown of law and order immediately following the October Revolution. The most well-known and most significant of these was the wine riots, or drink pogroms. This is when the wine cellars of the Winter Palace were ransacked and by soldiers and workers, and with all of these drunk soldiers in the streets, there were riots, there was looting, and assault was common. The mobs who raided the cellars of well-off people, so not just the Winter Palace, but also members of the bourgeoisie, would inevitably beat the people who they raided the cellars of. And even when officials had collections of wine and liquor destroyed and the contents poured into the streets, crowds gathered to drink the alcohol from the gutter. I'm quoting directly from your textbook here by Tom Ryan. Looting, robbery, and assault were also common, as well as murdering members of the bourgeoisie in the street. Now, this last point, Trotsky and the entire Sovnarkom, or the Bolsheviks, were largely endorsed this behavior. Trotsky is quoted as saying, "There is nothing immoral in the proletariat finishing off a class that is collapsing. That is its right." So while the new government didn't directly attack members of the bourgeoisie, they endorsed soldiers and workers to do so. In terms of political challenges, there were strikes by civil servants and ministerial staff. Again, directly from your textbook, Trotsky and Kollontai arrived for work at their respective ministries to be greeted with laughter and a mass walkout by staff. And Russia's civil servants went on strike in protest over the October coup. So civil servants and ministerial staff were on strike. Also, the Union of Russian Railroad Workers, led by Mensheviks and SRs, threatened to strike if the Bolsheviks refused to establish a socialist, a coalition socialist government. Lenin was unwilling to compromise, and this led to 5 leading Bolsheviks resigning from the Central Committee. The Bolsheviks, another political challenge was just that the Bolsheviks weren't ready to be in government. They were revolutionaries, not politicians. They were reactive rather than proactive. Lenin, in fact, said that Lenin told the Bolsheviks that they should wait and see what challenges arose, then respond accordingly, showing that they weren't very proactive. They were just reacting to the challenges that came up. In terms of the economic challenges faced by the Sovnarkom, state bank employees refused to give Sovnarkom officials any money. Until the 20th of November 1917, when the Bolsheviks, with the help of Red Guards, gained access to the state bank. But that is about 3 weeks when the new government had no money. So here is a painting by Ivan Vladimirov. He did many paintings of the early period of the new government, and this is showing the wine riots. So you can see soldiers wielding their guns and drinking wine, smashed windows, and you can see people running away on the right here. So it showed that it was a very violent time. Now that leads us to the Cheka. So in response to these challenges, Lenin argued that it was necessary to form a political police force. So on the 7th of December 1917, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Speculation and Sabotage was founded. Now that's a really long name to remember. It was commonly known as the Cheka. The Cheka was headed by Felix Dzerzhinsky, who is pictured here, otherwise known as Iron Felix. He was a member of the Military Revolutionary Committee and the head of security for Bolshevik headquarters. So he was a well-respected member of the Bolsheviks, and feared member of the Bolsheviks. While the Cheka was initially only given authority to publish lists of enemies of the people and to confiscate ration cards, their authority expanded, and this later developed into the powers of arrest, imprisonment, and even execution. So we will discuss the Cheka in future videos. This is only the first introduction to the Cheka, but they unleashed a period of terror throughout Russia, and particularly throughout Petrograd, where they executed political rivals. New decrees. So there are 2 slides here of new decrees. Now, I'm not going to talk about every new decree that was introduced because, as it says here, the Sovnarkom passed 116 new decrees in their first 2 months in power. So that's a lot of new decrees. And the reason that they passed so many new decrees is to try and amass support by the workers and soldiers and peasants. So here's a quote by Lenin. He said, "Yes, we shall destroy everything, and on the ruins we shall build our temple." Now, he's not talking, of course, about physically destroying everything. Instead, he's talking about destroying all the old systems and building a new socialist system through these decrees. So the first decree, well, the first two decrees happened on the 26th of October, 1917. They were the decree on land and the decree on peace. The decree on land gave peasants the right to seize land of the gentry and redistribute it. So immediately, that very first decree passed, managed to gain support from peasants. The decree on peace was a promise to negotiate a peace deal. Now, it should be noted that these first two decrees relate to Lenin's phrase from the April Theses, peace, bread, land, the things that the Bolsheviks were fighting for. And so immediately they are trying to deliver on those promises. The press decree was released on the 27th of October, 1917, and it banned the publication of newspapers belonging to political opponents, and most notably, and really exclusively, the Cadet Party. The decree on hours of work was released on the 29th of October, 1917, and this guaranteed workers an 8-hour workday and just improved working conditions overall. So again, this decree was brought about to try and amass support from workers. The Declaration on the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, released on the 2nd of November, 1917, promised the right to national self-determination or independence for various ethnic minorities. The one caveat to this was that these countries had to have socialist-style governments. So if these countries had regimes hostile to the Bolsheviks, then they would not be granted independence. The first country to declare independence was Finland, who declared their independence on the 17th of November, 1917. So this decree, the Declaration on the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, goes part of the way in explaining why all those Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden, etc., all have socialist governments. Now, the next decree was the Workers' Control Decree. Now, I should say this wasn't the next decree. The next one, it's just the next one we'll talk about. This was released on the 14th of November, 1917, and it gave industrial laborers the right to apply to the government to form self-management committees in their factories. Now, we'll talk again about this very shortly, because this decree came with some challenges in itself. We'll talk about two more decrees and then a few other changes. So the next decree was the proclamation declaring the Cadet Party an enemy of the people. This was on the 18th of November, 1917. And while it wasn't a formal decree, it banned the Cadet Party. This was after the Cadet Party organized an anti-Bolshevik protest of 50,000 people. So the Bolsheviks immediately went after the cadets, first by banning their newspapers and then by banning them as a party. And the final decree we'll talk about is the Decree on the Abolition of Estates and Civil Rights. This abolished estates being the land of the bourgeoisie, basically, and estate legal instruments. So classes, titles, and civilian ranks of the Russian Empire were abolished. And this also introduced the concept of Russian citizenship. So basically, with this decree, they essentially abolished the bourgeoisie and nobles as a class. Some other changes, they made reforms to women's rights. We'll talk about that in a much later video when we talk about women during the Russian Revolution. They made marriage a civil rather than church affair. They decriminalized homosexuality. I believe I said. They nationalized the banks, and they replaced the Julian calendar, the old style, with the Gregorian calendar, new style, on the 1st of February 1918. That's going to make all of our dates much easier to remember from then on out. Here's a quote from John Reed, who was an American journalist who was in Russia at the time. He said, "The Bolsheviks secured popular support by accomplishing the vast and simple desires of the people." So that really tells us that the reason for one reason for all of these new decrees was to try and placate the people, placate the workers, soldiers, peasants, and try and win their support. So there are just a few of the new decrees of the new government. So let's talk about state capitalism. State capitalism was a series of economic policies, and it should be noted the context for state capitalism. So the Bolsheviks inherited a collapsing economy. There was food and fuel shortages due to the ongoing war. Production was in danger of coming to a halt. And while all Bolsheviks agreed that they must move towards a socialist economy, there was debate over when and how they should do that. Nikolai Bukharin argued that the Bolsheviks should move towards a socialist economy immediately, but Lenin, in April 1918, proposed a transitional approach that came to be known as state capitalism. He argued that the government would exercise tight control over key industries. This was an element of the state part of state capitalism. The government would have a monopoly on trade, again, state. Financial policy would be directed through a state-owned bank. But most businesses and industries would retain their old managers and bosses. So that's the capitalist element of state capitalism. Lenin argued that the expertise of bourgeois experts was necessary in this transitional phase of development from capitalism to socialism. So state capitalism was a transitional move towards socialism while retaining some of the old systems and old roles of a capitalist economy. And finally, let's talk about challenges for state capitalism. So workers' committees feared the collapse of production and urged the government to take complete ownership and regulation of factories. Many workers took control of their workplaces from the bourgeois owners without official government approval. This relates to the Workers' Control Decree, where in Moscow and Petrograd, for every factory formally nationalized under the Workers' Control Decree, 4 more were seized without government permission. Lenin had called for a mixed economy, partly run by bourgeois specialists, but the proletariat was pushing the government away from this ideal. So the proletariat, the workers, they were pushing for a more socialist economy. So here's a super brief summary to wrap it all up. So the Sovnarkom faced many social, political, and economic challenges in its first few months in power. I should note that some others will be mentioned in our next video. And to overcome these challenges, the Cheka, or the political police, was established. Many new decrees were issued, and state capitalism was introduced. Now, I hope you found this video interesting and useful. Our next video will talk about the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, i.e. how the Soviets got out of World War I, as well as the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. Again, hope you found this interesting and useful, and I will see you next time.